Marcus Harris was a man who had learned long ago how to stay calm under pressure. He had grown up in a neighborhood where people judged each other quickly, often unfairly, and he knew that life sometimes tested a person's patience. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Marcus found himself driving through a small town on his way to a meeting. The town was quiet, with narrow streets lined with brick buildings and small shops that had been there for decades. The air smelled faintly of baked bread and fresh coffee from a nearby bakery. Marcus liked the calm feeling of these small towns. They had a rhythm that was slower than the city he usually worked in, a rhythm that sometimes allowed him to breathe deeply and reflect. As he drove past the town square, Marcus noticed a police car parked near the intersection. A uniformed officer waved him over. He carefully pulled his car to the side of the road, lowering the window politely. "Good morning, sir," said the officer, his tone formal. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Marcus shook his head, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "I was just driving through," he said quietly. The officer explained that he had noticed Marcus's car slightly over the speed limit. Marcus nodded, acknowledging the mistake. He had been a little over the limit but not dangerously so. The officer wrote the ticket carefully, his eyes scanning the form as Marcus watched silently. There was nothing Marcus could do at this moment. He took the ticket with a polite thank you, keeping his expression calm. This minor incident, he thought, would soon be forgotten. He drove slowly, adjusting his speed, making sure to follow all the signs. Yet, little did he know, this small ticket would lead him into a situation far more stressful than he had imagined. The following week, Marcus had to appear in the local courthouse to address the ticket. The building was old but well kept, with tall windows that let in the morning sun. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. People were waiting in the hallways, some murmuring quietly, others glancing at the large clock on the wall. Marcus took a seat near the back, quietly observing. He noticed the tension in the room. Some people were nervous, others impatient, and a few seemed annoyed at the slow movement of the proceedings. Marcus reminded himself to stay calm. Soon, it was his turn. The bailiff called his name, and Marcus walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. Judge Thompson sat behind a large wooden bench, his face stern and his eyes sharp. The judge's reputation was known in the town. Some admired his strictness, but many feared his quick temper and his tendency to speak harshly to those who appeared less confident. Marcus felt a brief tightening in his chest. Not because he feared the law, he respected it deeply, but because he knew prejudice could sometimes cloud judgment. He had seen it before, and he could recognize it in subtle ways. "Mr. Harris," Judge Thompson said, his voice loud enough for the room to hear clearly, "you are here because you failed to obey the traffic rules." His tone was firm, almost accusing. Marcus responded respectfully, "Yes, Your Honor. I was over the speed limit. I apologize." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Marcus. There was a pause that seemed longer than necessary, and Marcus felt the weight of it. Judge Thompson continued, speaking in a way that felt personal rather than professional. "It seems some people think rules do not apply to them. We cannot allow that in this town." Marcus listened carefully, nodding politely. He was aware that arguing aggressively would not help. His strategy was simple: be respectful, acknowledge the situation, and trust that fairness would prevail. But the judge's words carried an edge. They were sharper, more pointed than usual. Other defendants in the past had received smaller fines and simple warnings for similar violations. Marcus began to realize that something in the judge's attitude was different with him. The judge then announced the fine. Marcus blinked. The amount was much higher than what he expected. It was more than double the usual sum for this type of violation. He kept his expression neutral, fighting the urge to react immediately. Marcus had learned over the years that controlling reactions was a form of power. He quietly accepted the fine, asking only for confirmation of the payment process. Judge Thompson's face did not soften. Instead, he leaned back slightly, as if satisfied with the authority he had displayed. Outside the courtroom, Marcus walked slowly toward his car. His mind was busy, analyzing the interaction. He remembered every word, every glance. He had encountered prejudice before, but it never felt comfortable, never felt fair. Marcus was proud, educated, and professional. He had worked hard to reach a level of respect and responsibility in his career, and he knew that this unfair treatment had nothing to do with his abilities or character. Yet the sting of being judged differently because of his skin color was undeniable. He took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of frustration and resolve. As he drove away, he noticed a few townspeople standing near the courthouse, talking quietly among themselves. Their expressions suggested curiosity, maybe even sympathy, but no one approached him. Marcus did not expect anyone to intervene. He understood the social dynamics of small towns well. Often, people feared conflict or preferred to remain observers rather than participants. Still, he appreciated the silent acknowledgement that he had been treated unfairly. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his home office, reflecting on the day. The room was quiet, filled with books and papers related to his work as a federal prosecutor. He had chosen a career that demanded integrity, logic, and careful thought. He often dealt with complicated cases, where every detail mattered and fairness was not just a principle, but a necessity. Sitting at his desk, he considered the fine and the way the judge had treated him. The incident was minor in terms of law, but major in terms of personal impact. Marcus knew he would not allow it to pass without addressing it. He thought about the next steps. Filing an appeal or requesting a formal review of the fine could highlight the unfair treatment, but Marcus did not want to appear vindictive. His goal was to ensure that justice was applied equally. He wanted to demonstrate that professionalism, respect, and calm reasoning were stronger than anger or resentment. Marcus believed in the law, but he also believed in holding those who administered it accountable when bias interfered. That night, Marcus could not sleep easily. He replayed the scene in his mind, considering every nuance. The judge's tone, the words used, the subtle hints of unfair judgment, it all seemed deliberate. Marcus reminded himself that his reaction now could set the tone for what would follow. He could respond impulsively, allowing anger to guide his actions, or he could respond thoughtfully, using the situation to show dignity and integrity. He chose the latter. The following morning, Marcus reviewed the legal process for contesting the fine. He took notes, organized his arguments, and planned a respectful approach. He wanted to ensure that when he returned to the courthouse, he would be prepared, professional, and composed. Marcus knew that he would face Judge Thompson again. This time, he would enter with more confidence, knowing that his conduct, reputation, and knowledge of the law gave him strength beyond the courtroom bench. Outside the walls of his home office, the town continued its quiet rhythm. Shops opened, children walked to school, and the streets filled with the soft hum of daily life. Marcus looked out the window, thinking about fairness, justice, and human behavior. He understood that sometimes people made judgments based on appearance or assumptions rather than facts. He was determined to demonstrate, through calm action, that respect and professionalism could change perceptions. By the time Marcus left his house that morning to prepare for the next court appearance, he had made a decision. He would contest the fine, not to humiliate the judge, not to gain revenge, but to uphold the principle of fairness. Marcus's quiet determination carried a power that was stronger than anger. It was rooted in integrity, in knowledge, and in the belief that even in small towns with old prejudices, fairness and respect could prevail. And so, Marcus Harris, a man of quiet strength and unwavering dignity, prepared to face the courtroom once more. The unfair fine, the pointed remarks, and the subtle prejudice he had encountered would not define him. Instead, they would become the catalyst for a moment of truth, a test of character not only for himself but also for those in positions of authority who had forgotten that fairness and respect must come first. A few days after the unfair fine, Marcus Harris received a formal notice from the courthouse regarding the traffic violation. The document was routine in appearance, printed neatly on white paper with the courthouse's letterhead. However, as he scanned the contents, Marcus noticed the details of the fine, payment instructions, and the date set for a hearing to resolve the issue. He took a deep breath, aware that this was the first official step in challenging the fine. Marcus understood the importance of careful preparation. While the fine itself was not a huge amount, the principle of fairness mattered more. Marcus had always been organized and methodical. He returned to his home office and spread out his notes, pens, and legal references on his desk. His work as a federal prosecutor had trained him to be meticulous, attentive to every detail, and calm under pressure. For years, he had investigated complex cases, built arguments that held up in court, and navigated situations where emotions ran high. Yet, despite his experience, Marcus knew that facing a judge who had already shown bias would be a different challenge. It was not just about the law, it was about human behavior, assumptions, and perceptions. He reviewed the paperwork carefully. The judge's instructions were standard, but Marcus also remembered the tone of Judge Thompson during the courtroom session. There had been something personal in the way the judge spoke to him, something that went beyond the violation itself. Marcus could not ignore it. He knew that prejudice often influenced how authority figures treated people who looked different or came from backgrounds they did not fully understand. This awareness strengthened his resolve. He was not angry, but he was determined. He wanted to approach the situation logically, professionally, and with dignity. As Marcus prepared for the hearing, he considered the strategy he would take. He decided that the focus should not be on punishing the judge or making the situation personal. Instead, he would concentrate on the facts, the law, and the principle that justice must be impartial. He spent hours reviewing legal procedures, precedents, and ways to present his case clearly. Marcus also rehearsed his speech, practicing calm and respectful language, making sure that every word would reflect his professionalism. He understood that composure was a form of strength. The calmer and more collected he remained, the more impact his arguments would have. At the same time, Marcus thought about the implications of the hearing. Judge Thompson had no idea who Marcus really was. To the judge, he had appeared to be just another local resident, someone without influence or power beyond this small town. Marcus's real identity was different. He worked as a federal prosecutor in a nearby city, handling important cases, leading investigations, and earning respect from colleagues and the public. He had been trusted with responsibilities that required intelligence, fairness, and integrity. The contrast between his true role and the judge's assumptions was striking. Marcus smiled quietly, not out of pride, but because he understood that the truth often had a way of revealing itself at the right moment. When the day of the hearing arrived, Marcus dressed in a crisp suit. His appearance was professional but understated, reflecting his serious and calm demeanor. He arrived at the courthouse early, giving himself time to observe the environment and mentally prepare. The courtroom was quiet, filled with people waiting for their cases. Some seemed anxious, others impatient, but Marcus remained focused. He reminded himself that this moment was not just about the fine, it was about fairness, accountability, and the values he believed in. When the bailiff called his name, Marcus walked to the front of the courtroom with steady steps. Judge Thompson looked up from his papers, his expression neutral but slightly expectant. As Marcus began to speak, presenting the basic facts of the case, he noticed a subtle shift in the judge's attention. Marcus kept his voice calm and steady, explaining that while he accepted responsibility for the minor traffic violation, he believed the fine imposed was unusually high compared to standard practice. He cited the relevant regulations and legal precedents, showing that he had done thorough research. As Marcus continued, the judge glanced at the documents more closely. That was when the realization began. Marcus's full name and title were printed clearly on the official paperwork: Marcus Harris, Federal Prosecutor. Judge Thompson froze for a moment, his pen hovering over the bench. He had assumed Marcus was just an ordinary local resident, perhaps a young man unfamiliar with the law. Now, he understood that the man in front of him was someone with significant authority, knowledge, and respect in the legal world. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The staff and clerks noticed the change immediately. Whispers passed through the room as people recognized the significance of Marcus's position. Some of the judge's colleagues were present, and they exchanged glances, realizing that this was no ordinary traffic case. Marcus, however, did not rush or emphasize his status. He remained calm, professional, and focused on the principle of fairness rather than on the personal revelation of his identity. His behavior spoke volumes. It demonstrated that integrity and respect were more powerful than authority or intimidation. Judge Thompson struggled to regain his composure. His previous confidence, which had been so evident when he issued the high fine, began to falter. The realization that he had underestimated Marcus caused a moment of internal conflict. He had acted based on assumptions, influenced by bias, and now he faced someone whose reputation and career demanded respect. Marcus's calm and methodical presentation of the case highlighted the judge's error, not in an aggressive or confrontational way, but by simply showing the truth through professionalism and preparation. The courtroom atmosphere grew tense. Observers felt the shift in power dynamics. Marcus's quiet authority contrasted sharply with Judge Thompson's growing discomfort. The judge attempted to regain control by reviewing the fine, asking questions, and maintaining a formal tone, but it was clear that he had underestimated the situation. Marcus answered every question with clarity and composure, reinforcing that he was knowledgeable, reasonable, and respectful. The contrast between Marcus's demeanor and the judge's unease was striking. Outside the courtroom, news of the hearing began to spread. People in the town whispered about the identity of the man who had challenged the judge. They were intrigued by the idea that someone they had seen as an ordinary resident was, in fact, a federal prosecutor. The story highlighted the importance of humility, fairness, and not judging others based on appearances or assumptions. Marcus's actions demonstrated that professionalism and integrity could change perceptions and command respect, even in situations where bias was initially present. As the hearing continued, Marcus felt a sense of calm satisfaction. He was not there to humiliate the judge or to assert superiority. Instead, he wanted to ensure that the law was applied fairly and that the principle of justice was upheld. By quietly revealing his identity through the official documentation, Marcus allowed the truth to speak for itself. Judge Thompson now faced a decision not just about the fine, but about acknowledging his own assumptions and treating Marcus fairly moving forward. By the end of the day, it was clear that the hearing had shifted the balance. Marcus had maintained his dignity, demonstrated his knowledge, and highlighted the importance of fairness. Judge Thompson had begun to realize the error of his assumptions and the impact of his bias. The courtroom had witnessed a subtle but powerful lesson: respect and professionalism could overcome prejudice, and integrity had a way of revealing the truth without confrontation. After leaving the courthouse, Marcus reflected on the experience. He understood the power of preparation, calmness, and dignity. He had not sought to embarrass anyone, but his actions had naturally exposed the importance of fairness and respect. Marcus knew that his approach would leave a lasting impression, not just on Judge Thompson, but on everyone who had observed the hearing. His focus on principles over personal feelings reinforced his belief that justice, integrity, and patience could achieve meaningful outcomes, even in difficult situations. That evening, Marcus returned home, feeling a quiet sense of achievement. He reviewed the events of the day, thinking about how small actions, calm words, and careful preparation could influence even those in positions of authority. He recognized that prejudice often existed subtly, and that addressing it required patience, strategy, and self-control. Marcus had used his knowledge, professionalism, and dignity to ensure that fairness prevailed, showing that true power often lay in quiet strength rather than loud confrontation. As he looked out of his office window, Marcus saw the lights of the small town glowing softly. He understood that the story of the unfair fine was no longer just about a minor traffic violation. It had become an example of how respect, integrity, and calm reasoning could reveal truth, change perceptions, and uphold justice. Marcus felt confident that the next steps in the process would be met with fairness, and that Judge Thompson, now aware of who he truly was, would have to consider not only the law but also the principle of treating every person with respect, regardless of assumptions or prejudice. Marcus went to bed that night with a sense of quiet determination. The revelation of his identity had shifted the dynamics, but he remained focused on fairness, not personal satisfaction. He knew the journey was not over, and the next court appearance would be an important moment. Yet, he felt prepared, confident, and calm. Marcus Harris had turned an unfair situation into an opportunity to demonstrate the power of dignity, integrity, and professionalism. The small courthouse in the quiet town had become the stage for a moment that would teach lessons about fairness, respect, and the quiet strength of character. The day of the hearing finally came. The courthouse felt different this time. Word had spread quietly through the town about who Marcus Harris really was. Some people whispered in the hallways, saying things like, "Did you hear? That man is a federal prosecutor." Others shook their heads in disbelief. The same man who had been treated so unfairly a few weeks ago now carried a title that demanded respect far beyond the walls of this small town courtroom. Marcus walked through the entrance calmly, his step steady and his face composed. He wore a simple but sharp suit, nothing flashy, just professional. His presence carried quiet strength, and though he was alone, he did not look small or nervous. Instead, he appeared collected, prepared, and ready to face whatever came. The clerk at the front desk greeted him with a polite nod, this time with more care in her tone. She had heard the news too. Inside the courtroom, Judge Thompson sat behind the bench, flipping through paperwork. His face looked more serious than before. He was no longer dealing with what he thought was a regular traffic case. Now he was dealing with someone who understood the law as well as he did, perhaps even better. His eyes lifted when Marcus entered, and for a brief moment, there was an uncomfortable silence. The courtroom, filled with locals waiting for their own cases, seemed to sense that this hearing would be different. The bailiff called Marcus's name. He walked to the front with the same calm confidence he had practiced in his home office. He did not rush, did not hesitate. His posture was upright, and his voice was steady as he addressed the judge. "Good morning, Your Honor," Marcus began politely. "Mr. Harris," Judge Thompson replied, clearing his throat. "We are here to review the matter of your traffic violation and the fine that was issued." "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus said. He placed a folder on the table before him. "I would like to present my case today regarding the fine." From the first sentence, the difference in tone was noticeable. Marcus was not just another defendant pleading for a lower fine. He spoke with clarity, structure, and authority. He began by acknowledging the violation itself. "I do not deny that I was slightly over the speed limit," he said calmly. "I take full responsibility for that. However, the fine imposed was considerably higher than the standard set by law for such an offense." He opened his folder, pulling out documents, printed copies of regulations, and even examples of similar cases. The audience in the courtroom shifted in their seats, surprised at the level of detail. Marcus explained each point carefully, citing legal references and guidelines in simple words so that everyone could understand. He did not raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he relied on facts, fairness, and professionalism. His presentation was so clear that even those who knew little about law could see that something was not right with the fine he had been given. Judge Thompson listened, trying to maintain his usual stern expression. But inside, his thoughts raced. He had underestimated Marcus badly the first time. He had allowed assumptions to guide his actions, assuming Marcus was powerless. Now he was confronted by a man whose knowledge of the law was precise, whose professionalism was undeniable, and whose position as a federal prosecutor made it impossible to dismiss him lightly. At one point, Judge Thompson interrupted. "Mr. Harris, are you suggesting that this court acted outside of fairness?" Marcus paused, his calm eyes meeting the judge's. "I am suggesting, Your Honor, that fairness must be the foundation of every ruling. The law should be applied equally to all, without exception." The words carried weight. They were respectful, but they cut through the air like a clear bell. The people in the room leaned forward, sensing the power of the moment. Marcus was not attacking the judge personally, he was reminding him of the principle he was sworn to uphold. For a few seconds, the room was silent. Judge Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He tapped his pen against the papers in front of him, trying to maintain control of the situation. But the balance of power had already shifted. As Marcus continued, he demonstrated how the fine did not match legal standards. He showed comparisons, calmly pointing out that other individuals in similar situations had received much lower penalties. His words were logical, measured, and convincing. It was not just about his own case, it was about the broader principle of justice. The judge's discomfort grew. He realized that everyone in the courtroom could see the difference between the first hearing and this one. Before, he had been harsh, dismissive, and overly strict. Now, he was being shown that his decision had not only been unfair but also inconsistent with the law itself. And worse, the man he had underestimated was now calmly, respectfully proving it before an audience. The clerks scribbled notes quietly, their eyes flickering between Marcus and the judge. The bailiff stood motionless by the door, his expression unreadable, but even he seemed to feel the tension. The townspeople who had gathered leaned closer to one another, whispering softly, recognizing that something significant was happening. Marcus finished his explanation with simple but powerful words. "Your Honor, I ask not for special treatment, but only for equal treatment. Justice is not measured by who stands before the court, but by the fairness of the court itself." His statement struck deeply. The room fell into silence again. Judge Thompson looked down at his papers, then back at Marcus. For the first time, his sternness faded slightly. His authority remained, but his tone softened. "Mr. Harris," he said slowly, "you make a strong case." The judge glanced at the audience, aware that every word and every decision was being watched closely. He could feel the weight of accountability pressing on him. His earlier assumptions about Marcus had been shattered. He was no longer addressing just another defendant, he was addressing a man who represented the very law he claimed to protect. The remainder of the hearing moved cautiously. Judge Thompson asked questions, but Marcus answered each with clarity and composure. The more Marcus spoke, the more the courtroom saw the difference between a man who commanded respect through knowledge and dignity, and another who had relied too heavily on his position of power. By the time Marcus returned to his seat, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted entirely. The whispers in the room grew louder, filled with admiration and surprise. The people could see that Marcus had stood calmly and spoken truth to authority without anger, arrogance, or disrespect. He had shown that fairness was stronger than pride, and dignity more lasting than intimidation. Judge Thompson sat silently for a moment after closing the file. He cleared his throat and prepared to deliver his response, but even before he spoke, it was clear to everyone present that this hearing had been unlike any other. The man he had once underestimated had just demonstrated the very essence of justice, calm, fair, and equal for all. Marcus, meanwhile, remained quiet, waiting patiently. He had no need to raise his voice or seek victory through force. His actions and words had already spoken loudly enough. The courtroom was unusually quiet after Marcus finished presenting his case. The air was heavy, almost as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for Judge Thompson to respond. The judge shifted in his chair, tapping his pen against the wooden bench, his eyes moving between Marcus and the papers in front of him. He was a man used to being in control, used to having the final word in every matter. But now, for the first time in years, he felt the weight of accountability pressing down on him. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Mr. Harris, your arguments are thorough," he said slowly. His usual sharp tone was absent. Instead, there was hesitation, even discomfort. Everyone in the room noticed it. The same judge who once barked orders and gave out harsh punishments with confidence now looked unsettled. Marcus stood quietly, his posture calm, his hands resting lightly on the table before him. He did not smile, did not gloat, and did not show even the slightest sign of triumph. His demeanor remained professional, as though he were simply fulfilling his duty. That quiet strength made his presence even more powerful. Judge Thompson looked down at the fine he had imposed weeks earlier. At that time, he had felt certain that his decision was justifiable. He believed he was sending a message, maintaining authority, and keeping control of his courtroom. But now, as Marcus's words replayed in his mind, he realized that his decision had been clouded by prejudice. He had acted not with fairness, but with assumption. And now, in front of the entire room, those assumptions had been exposed. The judge leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "This court exists to serve justice," he began, speaking not just to Marcus, but to everyone present. "It is our duty to apply the law fairly and without bias. Upon reviewing the facts presented today, it is clear that the fine imposed was disproportionate to the violation." A murmur spread through the courtroom. People exchanged glances, whispering to one another. The tension that had filled the room since Marcus walked in now shifted into something else: curiosity and quiet admiration. They were witnessing something rare, a judge admitting fault. Judge Thompson paused, his face stern but less rigid than before. "Mr. Harris, I recognize that my ruling did not reflect the standards of fairness this court should uphold. For that, I must correct the error. The fine will be reduced to the standard amount set by law. Furthermore, I owe you an apology for the tone in which I addressed you during the previous session." The room went silent again. An apology from Judge Thompson was something almost no one in that town had ever heard. He was a man known for his pride, for rarely backing down, and for speaking firmly even when others disagreed. And yet here he was, acknowledging that he had been wrong. Marcus listened carefully, his face calm. He gave a polite nod. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said simply. His voice was steady, respectful, and without bitterness. He did not need to say more. The dignity with which he carried himself was enough to show that he had achieved what he came for: not revenge, but fairness. The judge shifted again, his eyes lingering on Marcus for a moment longer. There was a flicker of something in his expression, perhaps regret, perhaps respect. He understood now that the man standing before him was not only knowledgeable but also a living reminder of the values he himself was supposed to represent: integrity, fairness, and justice without prejudice. After the hearing ended, people left the courtroom slowly, still whispering about what they had seen. Some shook their heads in disbelief. "Did you hear that?" one woman whispered to her neighbor. "The judge actually apologized." Another man added quietly, "And to think, he treated Mr. Harris so badly the first time. Shows how wrong assumptions can be." Marcus walked out of the courthouse with the same calmness with which he had entered. He did not rush, did not look back, and did not seek recognition from the people around him. For him, this was not about winning against the judge, it was about ensuring fairness was restored. He knew the real lesson was not just for Judge Thompson, but for everyone who had witnessed the events. Meanwhile, Judge Thompson remained seated for several minutes after the courtroom cleared. He stared at the empty seats, his thoughts heavy. He had always believed himself to be a man of principle, someone who enforced the law strictly. But today had forced him to look at himself differently. He realized that fairness was not just about rules and regulations, it was about how people were treated, about respect, and about setting aside personal bias. For the first time in years, Judge Thompson felt humbled. He thought about the countless people who had stood before his bench in the past. How many of them had received harsher words or stricter punishments simply because he had assumed something about them. The thought unsettled him deeply. That evening, the judge sat in his study at home. The room was filled with law books, certificates, and reminders of his long career. Yet, for all the accomplishments that surrounded him, he felt a sense of unease. He realized that respect was not earned by the title of judge alone, but by the fairness and humility with which one carried out the role. He replayed Marcus's calm words in his mind: "Justice is not measured by who stands before the court, but by the fairness of the court itself." Those words echoed in him like a quiet truth he could no longer ignore. Across town, Marcus sat in his own office, writing notes about the case. He was not thinking about the judge's apology as a personal victory. Instead, he reflected on how important it was to stand up calmly against unfairness. He knew that many people in the courtroom that day had seen something that might change how they view justice. Marcus believed that sometimes the most powerful lessons were taught not through anger, but through quiet dignity. The story of the courtroom spread quickly through the town. People repeated it in shops, at dinner tables, and in quiet conversations. Some were surprised, others impressed. The tale became a reminder that even those in authority could be wrong, and that humility was a strength, not a weakness. For Judge Thompson, the day marked a turning point. He could not undo the mistake he had made, but he could change how he approached the bench in the future. Slowly, he began to treat defendants with more patience, listening more carefully, and speaking with less harshness. Some noticed the change immediately, while others were surprised that the once proud and stern judge now seemed more measured and thoughtful. Though the town did not forget the incident, they remembered it not as a scandal but as a lesson. It showed that even those with power could learn and grow, and that fairness, when demanded calmly and respectfully, could bring real change. Marcus, in his quiet way, had not only stood up for himself but had reminded a whole community of the true meaning of justice. When Marcus walked out of the courthouse that day, the sun was shining brightly. The world outside felt lighter, calmer, and somehow different from when he had first entered. People in the town square were still whispering about what they had just witnessed. Some looked at Marcus with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with quiet respect. He did not stop to seek praise or recognition, he simply walked with steady steps to his car, his expression calm and thoughtful. Inside, Marcus sat for a moment before starting the engine. He leaned back against the seat, taking a deep breath. It had been a long journey from the first day he received that ticket to the moment when justice finally found its balance. He felt a sense of relief, but more importantly, he felt proud that he had remained composed, respectful, and professional throughout the entire process. This was not just about a fine anymore, it had turned into a lesson about dignity, fairness, and the strength of character. Later that evening, Marcus met with a few close friends at his home. They sat around the dining table, sipping tea and sharing stories about their day. One of his friends, Daniel, leaned forward and said, "Marcus, you handled that better than anyone else I know. Most people would have been angry, maybe even shouted back at the judge. But you stayed calm and respectful. You showed everyone the true meaning of justice." Marcus smiled modestly. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "There were moments when I felt frustrated, even humiliated. But I knew that anger would only make things worse. The real challenge was not the fine, it was staying true to my principles, no matter how unfair the situation felt." Another friend, Lisa, nodded. "You didn't just win for yourself. You showed everyone that fairness is possible, even in a small courtroom where bias might exist. People will remember this." Marcus knew she was right. The incident had already become more than just his story. It was now a story for the community, a story that people would share as a reminder of what dignity and professionalism could achieve. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Thompson sat alone in his study. The courtroom was behind him, but the memory of that day lingered heavily in his mind. For years, he had carried himself with pride, believing that his authority was unquestionable. Yet in a single morning, a calm and respectful man had reminded him of his responsibility to be fair. The judge leaned back in his chair, staring at the shelves filled with books about law. He had always told himself that he stood for justice, but he realized now that true justice was not about power, it was about humility and equality. The judge thought about the many people who had stood before him in the past. Had he treated all of them with fairness? Or had his own assumptions clouded his judgment? The questions troubled him deeply. But along with regret came a sense of determination. He decided that from now on, he would be more patient, more careful, and more conscious of his words. Marcus Harris had left an impression that no legal book could have taught him. In the days that followed, the story continued to circulate. Shopkeepers mentioned it to their customers. Families discussed it at dinner tables. Some young people even told it to their friends as an example of standing up for what is right. The small town had learned something powerful: titles and appearances did not determine a person's worth, integrity did. One afternoon, Marcus received a letter. It was from a young law student who had been present in the courtroom during the hearing. The letter was written with sincerity: "Mr. Harris, watching you in the courtroom showed me that the law is not just about rules and punishment. It is about fairness, respect, and integrity. I want to be a lawyer like you someday, someone who upholds justice with dignity. Thank you for being an example." Marcus read the letter slowly, his heart warmed by the words. He placed it carefully in a folder where he kept meaningful notes and letters. For him, this was the real reward. It was not about lowering the fine or receiving an apology from the judge, it was about inspiring others to believe in justice and fairness. Weeks later, when Marcus returned to the town for work, he noticed small changes in the courthouse. Judge Thompson seemed more careful with his words. He listened more patiently to defendants, allowed them to speak fully, and treated them with a level of respect that had not been common before. It was clear that the incident had left an impact not only on the community but on the judge himself. Marcus reflected on this quietly. Change was rarely fast, but even small changes mattered. One act of dignity could ripple outward, touching lives in ways one could not always see. At home, Marcus spent time with his family. His children asked him about his work, and he told them about fairness in simple words they could understand. The law, he said, is like a scale. It should always stay balanced. If it tips too much to one side, then someone must speak up, not with anger, but with calmness and truth. His children listened closely, their young minds absorbing the wisdom in his words. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus moved on with his life, continuing his work as a federal prosecutor. Yet the story of the small-town courtroom remained in the back of his mind. It reminded him that justice was not just something written in books, it was something lived out in everyday actions, in the way people treated one another, and in the courage to stand calmly against unfairness. For Judge Thompson, the story became a turning point in his career. He no longer saw his bench as a throne of power but as a seat of responsibility. Though he never admitted it publicly, he knew that Marcus Harris had changed him. And while his pride still existed, it was now tempered with humility. For the townspeople, the story became part of their shared memory. Whenever someone mentioned the courthouse, people remembered the day the judge admitted his mistake and apologized. They remembered the calm man who had stood before him and spoken with quiet strength. And they remembered the lesson: true authority comes not from power, but from fairness. Marcus Harris never sought recognition, but his actions left a mark that could not be erased. He had shown that even in moments of unfair treatment, one could rise above anger and let dignity speak louder than pride. His story became a reminder to all who heard it that justice, when pursued with calm determination, had the power to change not only decisions but also hearts and minds. And so, the chapter closed not with bitterness or anger, but with reflection, growth, and hope. Marcus continued his journey, the judge learned humility, and the community gained a new understanding of fairness. In the end, the simple truth remained: integrity and respect are stronger than prejudice, and justice shines brightest when carried out with dignity.